Good evening, everyone.
Okay.
Salam, Alechem, and Shalom Alechem. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Beth Shalom Congregation and the Howard County Muslim Council, the Baltimore Jewish Council, and our other partners, including the Howard County Federation. And this is our last of our series of 4 programs talking about Israel, Arab, Muslim, Jewish interfaith dialogue, and we couldn't have timed this program better with everything that's been happening in the news for the last 24 hours. But before we start, I do want to thank some of our folks who've been helping putting this program together, our partners at the Baltimore Jewish Council. Our entire series couldn't have happened without their assistance, and particularly Mandy in the office has been our point person there. I want to thank her for all the hard work that she's done. And the existence of the Jewish-Muslim dialogue in the Baltimore Jewish Council is incredible. Our series was supported in part by the Carnegie Corporation project called Judaism and Islam in America, and it gathered together best practices around the country of efforts by Jewish and Muslim communities to foster interfaith dialogue. And Beth Shalom in general has been ahead of the curve, and the Baltimore Jewish Council has been really a pace setter in the nation for the kind of Muslim-Jewish dialogue that we've been doing here and that you've been doing in Baltimore, and now it'll be around the world, because this program is a pilot project for other communities in the country, so I thank you for that. Tonight, particularly, I want to thank Jeff Rubin, who's a member here at Beth Shalom and has been a creative partner with me on many of the things we do here, and his good offices at the Washington Institute for helping arrange our speakers for this evening. And without any further ado, I'd like to call upon Martha Wyman, who is the past president of the Baltimore Jewish Council and the current chair of the Muslim-Jewish Dialogue, to introduce our speakers this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good evening. This evening, we welcome our panelists, Dr. David Pollak and Mr. Ghaith Al-Omari, as well as our moderator, Dr. Arthur Abramson. Dr. Pollak is the Kaufman Fellow at the Washington Institute, focusing on the political dynamics of Middle East countries. He served previously as senior advisor for the broader Middle East at the State Department. From 1996 to 2001, Dr. Pollak served in several other State Department policy advisory positions covering South Asia and the Middle East, including 4 years as regional expert on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff. Dr. Pollak has been a visiting lecturer at Harvard University, where he attained both his undergraduate and doctoral degrees. He is fluent in Arabic, Hebrew, French, and several other languages. He is a frequent visitor to the Middle East and has just returned from a trip to Iraqi Kurdistan, where he explored the impact of Iran, Syria, and Al-Qaeda on the Kurdish issue and on the greater Middle East. Ghaith Al-Omari is executive director at the American Task Force on Palestine. Prior to that, he served in various positions within the Palestinian Authority, including director of the International Relations Department in the Office of the Palestinian President and advisor to former Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas. In these capacities, he provided advice on foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis the United States and Israel, and security. He has extensive experience in the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, having been an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team throughout the permanent status negotiations. In that capacity, he participated in various negotiating rounds, most notably the Camp David Summit and the Taba talks. After the breakdown of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, he was the lead Palestinian drafter of the Geneva Initiative an unofficial model peace agreement negotiated between leading Palestinian and Israeli public figures. Mr. Al-Omari is a lawyer by training and a graduate of Georgetown and Oxford universities. Prior to his involvement in the Middle East process, he taught international law in Jordan and was active in human rights advocacy. Dr. Art Abramson, Executive Director of the Baltimore Jewish Council since 1990, was previously the Community Relations Director for the Jewish Federation of Greater Houston. Prior to that, he was the Washington State Area Director for the American Jewish Committee, the AJC. He also served as an Assistant Area Director for the AJC in its Los Angeles office. Before joining the American Jewish Committee, he taught political science for 4 years at the University of California at Los Angeles and the California State University at Northridge. His areas of expertise include the international relations and politics of the Middle East, American foreign policy, and American government. A native of New York City, he attended Queens College of the City University of New York, where he received his BA degree. He earned his MA and PhD degrees at UCLA in the field of political science. And we're going to, and you will be able to, I'm going to go off script for just a minute. You'll be able to catch Art on WBAL TV tonight at 11 o'clock. And Dr. Pollak, I invite you to begin.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure and a privilege to be here, and I especially welcome the opportunity for a discussion with all of you on what I understand is an interfaith basis, which is really a great tribute to the organization and to all of you for participating in it. I've spoken very often over the years about different Middle East issues, but it's not always that you actually get a group of diverse people together in the same place to have a dialogue about it. And I really feel deeply that this is a terrific opportunity for all of us. So before I begin the main substance of what I'd like to say in just 10 minutes or so, Jeff Rubin asked me to say just a word or two about my own personal background. And I will just put it this way. I have, since childhood, since high school, I guess, a very strong interest in the Middle East that was actually sparked by the Six-Day War of 1967 when I was in high school. And I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I attended Jewish day schools right through high school. So I knew Hebrew. But the Six-Day War inspired me to try and learn something about what I saw back then as, quote, the other side, unquote. And so when I started college the next year, many people thought I was a little crazy, especially my own family, but I decided to study Arabic. And that got me, that was the beginning of this long journey that brought me here today. I spent the next several years learning Arabic and studying Islamic civilization and history and culture and Middle East politics, and studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and also at the American University in Cairo. And then spent a few years teaching issues as a professor at Harvard, at George Washington University, and at Cornell. And then I went into the government, and I spent about 25 years, most of my career, working in the U.S. government on these issues. And I'll tell you just a little tiny bit more about that in a moment. Then I retired from the State Department about 6 years ago, and since then I've been a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a think tank in downtown D.C. that deals with all of these issues. So what did I do in the U.S. government on all of this? Well, besides the positions that were mentioned in the very kind introduction, I spent about half of my career studying public opinion in the Middle East. And the reason I want to talk about that is, or begin my remarks really with that issue, is that it seems to me that while we often look at this whole issue of Israel and the Palestinian issue and the broader issues of coexistence in the region through the eyes of the headlines and the formal diplomatic negotiations or the maneuvering behind the scenes of government officials and security experts and so on, the reality is that this conflict and this possibility of coexistence is one that actually involves real people, ordinary people, millions of them. And their attitudes, their opinions, their experiences really matter because at bottom, it is their views of each other that I think is going to play a crucial part in determining whether there is peace or war, whether there is real coexistence or just some ice-cold stalemate, an armed truce between the two sides. It's the attitudes of the people that are really important. And of course in Israel, especially, but also among the Palestinians and increasingly in the Arab world, what ordinary people think and how they vote in elections really has a crucial influence on their government's policy. And so it's important to understand, and I felt way back in the 1980s when I started this work in the US government, it's important to understand how people see the conflict, not just how diplomats or generals or presidents see it. So I spent years trying to figure out, first of all, how to find out what people really think. And it was relatively easy in Israel, where there are public opinion polls that have been going on for many years, and you can take your pick every day almost. There's some reasonably credible public opinion poll that appears in the Israeli media about what people in Israel think about Arabs, about the Palestinians, about the peace process, about the United States, about the Iranian nuclear issue, about all kinds of issues. It was much harder when I started to find out more about what Arabs and especially what Palestinians thought. But I was fortunate in that at a certain point, sort of mid-career, we had in 1993, 20 years ago by now, hard to believe, but 20 years ago, we had the Oslo Accords, which enabled the beginning of a peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, but also as a byproduct, enabled the Palestinians themselves to do public opinion polls of their own people for the first time in a serious scientific way, free of direct Israeli control and also free of some of the taboos that had characterized many relatively traditional societies in the region, roughly up until that point. And so I was sent by the US government to help the Palestinians develop their own capabilities, professional capabilities to do public opinion polls. And right from the start, right after the first Oslo Accord in 1993, I had an experience that I want to just relate to you as a very brief anecdote. The first time that, with a little bit of technical help from me and from some other experts, there was a center that was set up in Nablus in the northern West Bank to do Palestinian public opinion polls. And the very first poll that they conducted using standard probability procedures, right, the standard way that polls are conducted, I was privileged to be helping out as a supervisor in the field. And I went out into the field with Palestinian, with interviewers and with a field supervisor whose name was Samir, a Palestinian. And he came from a town near, not too far from Nablus, or sort of in between Nablus and Tulkarm in the West Bank, a place called Anabta. A very beautiful small town. And he said to me, why don't we go around and you can observe some of the interviews, observe how the interviewers pick the household at random to interview and the person in the household to interview at random. And at some point, if you like, you can actually do an interview yourself, since you speak Arabic, and go and interview somebody and just experience for yourself how this public opinion poll is working. So I said, fine. And then we walked around the town, and I watched the interviewers pick households and pick people and administer the interviews. And as we were walking, Samir was telling me how much he was grateful for the opportunity, finally, in the Oslo Accords, to imagine that one day there could actually be peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and how even though he and his family had participated in the first Intifada, the uprising against Israeli occupation in the previous several years, he was delighted that the time had finally come, he thought. This is 20 years ago, and the time still hasn't come. But he thought how delighted he was to imagine that there could be an end to the suffering and the bloodshed on both sides. And he welcomed the idea of working with Israelis to build a common future of peace and prosperity. And I was very touched by this. And then we continued walking around the town and observing some interviews. And then he said, we came to a house that was picked at random. And he said, okay, why don't you go into that house and do the interview there yourself? And so I went into the house, and I discovered that there was a middle-aged woman who was the mother of the household, who was the only person at home. And so she was going to be the one that I interviewed. And I discovered as I started the interview that all around her were pictures draped in black of one of her sons who had been killed in the Intifada, and that she was still in mourning for one of her sons. And it was very difficult to conduct the interview under those circumstances, but I did it as best I could. And when I came out, really feeling anguished and upset by this whole experience, I said to Samir, Samir, did you know that the woman in that house recently lost one of her sons in the Intifada? And Samir said to me, yes, I know. That's my mother. And that experience of someone who has lived through the conflict and lost close relatives to it, as many people on both sides have over so many years, and yet was so full of the yearning for peace, in spite of that, or maybe because of the human toll that the conflict has taken, not only on his side, on his people, but on the other side that he could empathize with, is something that left a very deep impression on me. And as I continued to do this work, I met Israelis who had the same experiences and the same feelings about it. And at the same time, to be honest, I met many people on both sides who had a very different feeling, who wanted revenge, not peace, who wanted the conflict to be settled only on their terms, if at all, not in a way that would actually reflect a compromise between these two intractable positions. And it was my job to try and figure out what was it that could tip the balance on both sides, between the people who wanted peace in spite of everything and the people who either wanted the conflict to continue until they won or wouldn't agree to settle on any terms that might be acceptable to the other side. And what I found after many years of research, and I continue to do this research today outside the government, I think I could sum up as follows. People, a majority of people on both sides, and I don't want to romanticize this, there are still people on both sides, both Israelis and Palestinians, who maintain what I would consider very hardline positions, positions that are mutually exclusive and therefore would perpetuate the conflict. But a majority of people, 60% or so on both sides, would be willing to compromise in order to settle the conflict once and for all and coexist peacefully side by side, an independent Israel and an independent Palestinian state. But this majority on both sides, at the same time that it believes that its own people want peace, and they're right in believing that, they also believe that the other side doesn't really want peace, that the other side would never really agree and keep the agreement. And therefore, what you have is a situation which continues to this very day, in which people on each side who would themselves be willing to compromise don't see a partner on the other side. And it's understandable. If you look at the Second Intifada, if you look at Israeli settlements in the West Bank, you can understand why each side tends to believe that the other side is not really willing to compromise. But the tragedy is that actually both of them are willing to compromise. If only they could find enough reason, enough incentive, enough guarantees, enough of a framework in which the other side could be trusted in order to take the risks and make the concessions that would be necessary to make a deal. So how to do it? How to bridge this gap between each side's willingness to compromise, at least the majority of people on each side, and each side's perception of the other side as not a reliable partner for peace? Well, messages are very important. Public messages. It's just as important, in my view, what people say out loud in public as all of the details of all the secret negotiations that might be going on between Israelis and Palestinians today, or between Iranian and American and other officials over the last few days, or any other case of diplomatic maneuvers. What people say in public makes a big difference, because that's what people hear, ordinary people, and that shapes their perceptions of what's possible and what's not possible. So because of the research that I was doing, and I'm going to conclude with just two quick anecdotes about this. I was privileged on one of my recent trips to the region to speak to some very senior Israeli and Palestinian officials about this very issue. And they gave me permission to relate some of these, part of these conversations to you and to other audiences. So let me start on the Israeli side with Shimon Peres, the president of Israel. I had the privilege of, because of the research that I was doing on this issue of messages from one side to the other, I had the privilege of having a private meeting with him for about an hour just a few months ago. And I tried to make the case, which I thought would be very easy to him, because he's known as a man who really does want peace and is trying to nudge his own government in that direction. I tried to make the case that even if you couldn't stop all of the negative messages that were coming from both sides, right, one to the other, incitement to violence or to discrimination or to hardline positions on either side, even if you couldn't stop all of that because of free speech and because of deeply held feelings that people have on both sides, maybe what you could do was to promote positive messages from leaders on both sides, government officials, but also other public figures. And Shimon Peres, as is his habit, told me a joke to make a point about why this was not enough, why it might be a good idea, but it was not going to be enough. And the story went like this. He said, I had a friend who was so passionately in love with his girlfriend that every single day he sent her a love letter, special delivery, a beautiful love letter, special delivery. So what happened? After a month, she married the mailman. I thought this was really a great story, because it's funny, but it also makes a very serious point. The point is that messages are fine. Beautiful words are nice. But what really matters is being there, actually what you do in person, right? Actually being part of a process of meeting the other side, of working with the people on the other side, of interacting personally, directly with them. That's what has to matter. And so what people do in their interactions with each other is more important than even the most beautiful love letter or the most positive political messages. Very important point. But I think both matter. Okay, that's my point. And I met afterwards, the next day actually, with Saeb Erekat, who was then and still is today one of the chief negotiator on the Palestinian side of the current negotiations that are underway secretly between Israelis and Palestinians with a little bit of American support. And I asked him, what about this idea of sending positive messages? What about the idea of a Palestinian official, like President Abbas or somebody else, saying something that about peace, something positive, something encouraging, saying something about Israel's right to exist, or about Israel's Jewish nature, or something that he knows and Israelis tell us, and I know, something that might encourage the Israeli public and even the Israeli government to be more willing to think about a compromise. And Erekat, he didn't tell me a joke, but he said in all seriousness, and this is something, I don't want to romanticize this issue. This is something that we need to think about. He said, that's fine, but you know that if the Palestinian side makes a statement like that, there are hardliners in our own community who are going to object, who are going to criticize, who are going to put a person who makes statements like that in a very difficult political position. And you know that if we are going to make a statement like that, we want something back. We want the Israelis to reciprocate. We want to hear something positive from them. Why should we be the only ones who are going to send a positive message like that if they ignore it, or they actually dismiss it, or some of them say that we're just trying to fool them, we're lying? And he said, and finally, why should we negotiate these very, very difficult issues in public? Why should I, or my president, or someone on my side, why should we give away something that we want actually to negotiate? So you can't expect positive messages until there's more progress to resolving the actual serious issues. In a way, it's kind of the counterpoint to what Shimon Peres says. The messages matter, but they have to be matched by actions. They have to be accompanied by real progress toward compromise. And so I want to just leave you with a conclusion that I draw from all of this experience and all of these meetings and jokes and anecdotes over many years. I do think that the long-term trend in this conflict, going way back to when I started working on it in high school and in college, the long-term trend is positive. There is peace between Egypt and Israel, which many of us for many years thought was unimaginable, and a peace that has lasted despite decades of crisis all around the region and inside Egypt itself in the last few years. And there is an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians that it's true, it hasn't come to fruition over 20 years, but it hasn't been abandoned either. And it's going to take more work, and maybe, God knows, another 20 years in order to make this agreement finally bear fruit. But I do believe that given the attitudes of ordinary people on both sides who want peace, for the most part, again, not all of them, but most of them, I do believe that someday that will happen in our lifetime. Thanks very much.
Well, Dave and I, we've been friends for a very long time. This is the first time, actually, we've shared the stage, and I must say, how am I going to follow that one? That was a really powerful one, David.
Well, thank you.
Let me start, though, by thanks. Thank you, Jeff Rubin, for bringing me here, both figuratively by approaching me and telling me about this, and physically by driving me from DC to here. Thanks. And thank you, Rabbi, for opening really the synagogue and the congregation, and for finding a kippah that matches my tie. And thank you all for being here on a cold, miserable Sunday night for what I believe actually is a very special series of events. I mean, I've done scores of these events, but rarely do I come to events that actually are under the banner of Jewish community organizations and Muslim community organizations. That is powerful. That is effective. You talked about messaging. That is an important message. I hope I see more of this across the country. We need this. We need to be talking at this point. Like David, I'm going to start maybe with a personal, my personal journey. I must say it's a bit hard. I'm a lawyer by training, and at law school, they teach you to put aside your humanity and your personal and to focus on the policy. And I would focus on the policy. That's what I do. But I think the person is important. Why did I come here? I grew up in Jordan. I'm actually not Palestinian. I'm ethnic Jordanian, the minority in that country. I grew up in the 70s and 80s with the issue of Palestine being the dominant issue. You said in my CV that I used to do human rights activism, and every time we tried to push for democracy, for something like this, our government, our intelligence services will say, this is not the time. Let's resolve the Palestinian issue first. It was there, ever present. And I say, as a teenager and as a college student, my reaction to that was to basically avoid it. I did my master's in feminist legal theory. I was doing my work as I was doing my PhD on sub-Saharan Africa, the Rwanda genocide, these kind of issues. And at some point, I realized I'm not PhD material. I don't have what it takes to do it. I was having dinner with a friend, and he basically offered me a job as a human rights lawyer in Palestine. He was running an organization. Offered my girlfriend at that time, my wife now, a job as a psychologist in another organization he was running. So we figured, why not? Let's go to Palestine for a year. I went there as a human rights activist, as I said, realized very quickly that the dominant narrative and concern for Palestinians is the issue of liberation. Everything else, for good or for ill, everything else was secondary to that. I got engaged through a number of accidents in the Palestinian negotiation issue. It started out as a professional fascination, and it's professionally very fascinating. The idea as a negotiator of taking what looks like and what we were taught as a zero-sum thing, zero-sum dynamic, and actually turning it into a potential win-win. To me, that was and still is fascinating. But the moment maybe that was the personal epiphany that gave me my, if you wish, emotional commitment to the issue was a moment similar actually to the one that you mentioned with Arab Tawi, Samir. I was going to a negotiation session. I get a phone call from a friend, a colleague, saying, look, I am at so-and-so place in East Jerusalem. The Israelis are coming to demolish a house. The owner of the house is there. Talk to him. He gives him his cell phone. I start talking. The guy is, of course, panicking. His house is going to be blown up. I pick up the phone, call my friend at the Israeli Prime Minister's office. We're talking, and suddenly a huge explosion. I hear it on the phone. The guy starts, swearing and screaming, and he hangs up on me. And I then had to make a decision. I was, of course, angry, extremely angry, as anyone would be in that situation. I had to ask myself, do I go to the negotiation session or do I go back home? My gut feeling is to go back home. I don't want to see an Israeli. I don't want to talk to an Israeli, the rest of it. But then the question I had to ask myself, what would I achieve? Yeah, I'll feel better about myself. I can tell my friends how I stood for a principle. But then what? Another house is going to be blown up. Another life is going to be shattered. And I learned something from that. I learned, and this is what sustains my engagement, it is not about me. It's not about my feelings. It's not about an idea. It's not about justice or scoring debating points. It is about changing. For me, every day that this continues is that someone dies, someone's livelihood ends, someone's life is unraveled, and this is just ethically, to me, I find it unacceptable. So for me, while the engagement is emotional and ethical, I do believe, though, that the approach that we should have to it is professional, needs to be professional, and needs to be in many ways lawyerly. You know, we lawyers have many bad traits, but we do have some good traits. Actually, partly, how do we reach a solution that is not perfect? It cannot be perfect. We all have to compromise, and compromise not only on simple issues, but at some point on fundamental issues, but something that is better than today. As someone who believes in a two-state solution, I actually have some good news. I know we're used to hearing bad news every time we talk about the Middle East, and I'm sorry if I'm disappointing anyone here, but I do believe that there are signs for hope. As David said, we cannot be Pollyannish about it. It has not worked for so long. There are many those who are out there who are willing to destroy it and willing to use tools that we will never use. Terrorism, violence, you name it, dehumanization, etc. But all of that said, there are good signs. The first good sign, of course, is the fact that the sides are talking. We take it for granted. We can't take it for granted. Remember, for 2 years before this, they were not talking. For decades before that, they were not talking. Yet today, they are talking. More importantly, perhaps, we know what they're talking about. We know what the end game is. We are talking about a two-state solution, a state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel. Again, some of us, especially the younger generation, takes it for granted. We cannot take it for granted. I remember during the negotiations in 1999-2000, Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister on the left, the Labour Israeli prime minister, never uttered the word Palestinian state. More than that, when his chief negotiator, Oded Iran, once said it by mistake, he was publicly reprimanded for saying it. Fast forward a few years, Ariel Sharon. You can say whatever you want to say about Sharon, he was not a dove. Yet, he was the first Israeli prime minister to recognize the two-state solution, followed by Olmert, and now Bibi, Netanyahu. The United States, Clinton never uttered those words. It took George W. Bush to talk about the two-state solution. Today, Obama talks about it as a core national security interest. You look at the Arab world. For those of you who remember 1967, Dave, you remember the Khartoum Arab League Summit that produced what we know as the 3 no's. No negotiation with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no normalization with Israel. Fast forward a few decades, 2003 was it, or something like that. The Arab League meets in Beirut, issues something called the Arab Peace Initiative, which basically says, in exchange for ending the occupation, Israel will not only get recognition, but also normalization. Turns from an existential, zero-sum conflict to basically a conflict on real estate. I mean, I'm maybe oversimplifying, but basically, the nature of the conflict changes. The sides, the publics, as you said, Dave, consistently, at the good times and at the bad times, continue to support a two-state solution. More than that, that was my second good point. The third good point is we actually know what the contours of a permanent deal look like. If not the contours, then at least the menu of options of all of the issues. Again, I remember as a young negotiator in 1999-2000, going into the negotiating room, throwing ideas out there, not really knowing how the Israelis are going to react. We were testing what's in the realm of the possible and what's not. Fast forward, countless negotiation sessions, books written, memos leaked, etc., etc., etc. We know what it looks like. And very briefly, I would say, 2 states, Palestine and Israel, as I said, living side by side. The borders are going to be based on the 1967 lines. That's the line where the hostilities ended in 1967. In 1949, not 67. Yet, when we were negotiating, we had a dilemma. The dilemma called settlements. Now, settlements, as any of you, of course, knows, from a Palestinian narrative, and I tend to believe this narrative, I subscribe to it, are illegal, and if in a perfect world, they should all be dismantled. The reality is, however, no Israeli prime minister, no matter how progressive, lefty, etc., he or she is, can dislodge and remove 400,000 to 500,000 Israelis from what is today their homes in the West Bank. So if we wanted to deal, we had to reach something what to do with the settlements. Rather than approaching this issue as an issue of who's right and who's wrong, we started using one of the tools as negotiators. Let's look at the interests. What do the Israelis need? What do the Palestinians need? The Israeli prime minister needs to be able to stand and say to his or her public, I uprooted a minimal number of settlers. The Palestinian president needs to stand up and say to his public, I don't see a Palestinian woman president anytime soon, so to his public that I got the 1967 borders. We actually came up with a solution. The solution is Israel annexes those settlements that are adjacent to Israel that would not threaten the future sustainability of a Palestinian state. In exchange, it gives the Palestinians parts from within Israel equal in size to the parts that it gets. So both sides get what they want. The lesson I learned from here is, it is important not only to think of your own victory speech. Of course, that's your main objective. But of the other side's victory speech. What value is a peace deal for me that an Israeli prime minister cannot sell to his public or to her public? None. We have to be sensitive to the needs of each side. So the first one and the most important one is borders. Then you have Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is if you wish, the bitter pill that Israel has to swallow in this peace deal. Jerusalem will have to be divided. Jerusalem will have to be two capitals for two states. And you know what? It's not that difficult. President Clinton, in the end of his term, figured it out. I don't know how many of you have been to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, for the most part, is a city like any other city. Unfortunately in general, but fortunately for our own purpose here, it's a segregated city. There are Jewish neighborhoods where very few, if any, Arabs live, and equally there are Arab neighborhoods where very few, if any, Jews live. So you divide the city based on the neighborhoods. The old city, the Holy Basin, you cannot divide. You can divide it on a map, and I think you should divide it on a map. But ultimately, we have to come up with a joint management regime, and it's not that difficult. It's a walled city, the old city. It has walls around it. It's very easy to manage the issues of security and commerce and municipal issues within it. We are left with one issue. Once all of this is done, in the holiest of the holy sites, in the heart of the old city, Haram al-Sharif, as we call it in Arabic, Har Habayit, I think, is that the Hebrew word for it? The Temple Mount. Again, we know the arrangements. They are like today. Today, Muslim authorities control the Muslim parts and Jewish authorities control the Jewish parts. That's the way it's going to be in the future. What we do not know is whose flag is going to fly over that. And to that, there is no rational answer. That's an answer that will have to be given at the very end of the negotiations by the leaders. The third issue is the issue of refugees. And that is the bitter pill that the Palestinians will have to swallow. Israel was created for one reason and one reason alone: to be the homeland of the Jewish people. And no state on earth is going to sign off its own death warrant. If the Palestinians continue insisting on the return of 7 or 8 million Palestinian refugees into what was their homes, there will be no peace deal. Hard to swallow for Palestinians, yet this is the choice we have. Peace and statehood and no right of return, or no peace, no statehood, and no right of return. But this is the Palestinian compromise. That said, we have to do everything we can, and there are ways to do it, to give the refugees dignity. Whether through financial compensation, giving them the right to go back to their homeland, which is the Palestinian state. All of these options are out there. One issue here, on the issue of refugees, which I found, and still in my mind, the most complicated, in the same way that the issue whose flag is going to fly on the Haram al-Sharif is complicated, is the issue in the context of the refugees. What do you do with the past? Let me elaborate a bit on this point. It was my misfortune in the Taba negotiations at the end of the Barak era to be asked by my principals, by my leaders, to go with my Israeli counterpart, to go and come up with a joint narrative of what happened in 1948. We wanted an apology from the Israelis on what happened in 1948. I sat with my friend, my colleague on the Israeli side. We got our coffee, got our cigarettes, started talking. His name is Daniel. So I say, Daniel, what do you call 1948? It's the year of independence. The diaspora ended. The state was created. It was a great year. I call it in Arabic an-Nakba, the catastrophe. You will not find a sane Palestinian person who will tell you that 1948 was a good year. I have come to believe, based on that and future experiences, that you cannot negotiate the past. If we hold an agreement hostage to agreeing on who was wrong in 1948, we will never get a peace agreement. And history will be the enemy of the future. That said, while we cannot agree on the past, we have to appreciate and understand the past. But not through negotiations, through a different process. Personally, I grew up, as I said, in Jordan, and I think like most of the Arab world, thinking that when an Israeli tells me that 1948 was a good year, or they love Jerusalem, or whatever, they're doing it to undermine my own narrative. And I'm sure many Israelis grew up thinking the same. And it took me 2 years of basically spending more time with my Israeli counterparts than I did with my wife to realize that when they say that, actually they mean it. Not to undermine my narrative, but as a way of expressing their narrative. And I think both parties, both publics, have to be exposed to each other's narratives. So these are the good parts. We know what the objective is, we're talking about it, and we know what the contours are. Yet, we do not have a deal. And yet, we should not underestimate the negative. And I will quickly touch on the negative, and conclude with that. The narrative is not about policy. We don't need any more creative thinking. The negative is about politics. It's about the realpolitik, both in the domestic front and on the regional front. Domestically, I will not talk much about Israel, but I would say the following. I was on a panel a few months ago with a guy called Danny Danon. Danny is a very senior Likud guy. I said, as I said to you before here, that, Israel believes in a two-state solution. And he spent maybe 15 minutes explaining to me how Netanyahu and Sharon and all of these people are wrong, and the Likud party of Bibi, is going to make Bibi Netanyahu pay for that mistake that he did. There are rejectionists there. I will not dwell much on it. On the Palestinian side also, there are rejectionists. I'm not going to talk about Hamas. I actually think Hamas is less of a problem. I'm a believer that Hamas has to continue being isolated, though I do believe that Gaza should not be isolated. I think we should differentiate between the two, and the Gazan civilians should not be punished for Hamas. But I think Hamas is contained. I think the issue is with the rejectionists within the national movement itself. The issues are within relating more or less to the substance, because as you said, Dave, one poll after the other tells that the Palestinians believe in the contours that I mentioned. But part of the problem is about the legitimacy and credibility of the Palestinian Authority today. We have to be frank about this. There are issues of legitimacy and credibility. When Hamas won the elections, when they did, it was not because they were calling for violence and terrorism. It's because they hit my guys, I was working for them then, on issues of corruption and bad governance or what have you. And that's an issue that Palestinians have to work very, very closely on, and they have been. Former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad started a very interesting, fascinating reform project that dealt with both corruptions and security components. We have to make sure the Palestinians continue working on that, because if you are credible as a government, as a messenger, your message will also be credible when it comes down to selling it to your public. The second set of issues I would touch on in terms of what makes it complicated is the regional issue. And there's no day like today to talk about it now that we have the Iran issue there. And let me start by saying that I'm approaching this with great humility, because frankly, anyone who tells you they know what's going on is either lying to you or to themselves. What happened over the last 2-3 years defied all of our expectations. So we have a situation where there's so much uncertainty happening in the region. Right now, the defining issue is Iran. And everything else, including our issue these days, is derivative. And therefore, the way the Iran issue plays out will very much determine the chances of success or failure on this issue. I do not see Bibi Netanyahu willing to move on this issue, especially that it's now seen as an issue that is being pushed primarily by the US. And we all know that right now between Netanyahu, or between Israel and the US, there are serious concerns, unless he sees that his interests are being met. And equally with the Arab countries. And I do not believe that Abbas can move forward with a peace deal without Arab support, particularly Egypt and Saudi. And they also will not be supportive of peace on the Middle East unless their concerns vis-a-vis Iran are met. As I look over the next few months, I think the success or failure of this issue, of the Iran issue, and with that, I would say the security and strategic architecture of the region hinges on three main concerns, main issues. One, Iran itself. Will Iran live up to its commitments on the nuclear issue? But even maybe more importantly than this, will Iran see this nuclear deal as a carte blanche, as a green light, to go and start intensifying its meddling with regional issues, whether in terms of the Gulf or Hezbollah or what have you? Because this is what the Arabs and the Israelis will be keeping an eye on. That's one. The second issue I'll be looking at is US behavior. This issue, this recent deal, maybe understandably, was done without consultation with the regional allies, and the regional allies feel extremely anxious. Talking to Israelis, talking to Arab officials, they are very anxious that this deal is a prelude for their interest being compromised for the sake of Iran in terms of regional hegemony. And I think a lot, and frankly, there's a loss of faith in the US and the US administration when it comes to this. And I think the US ability over the next few months to engage with the Arab and the Israeli partners and allies that we have and convince them that they can trust us in this country to look after their interest will be key in terms of the ability to lead in the region. And finally, of course, it depends on the behavior of our allies themselves. Will we have restraint, or will we have tension and concern translated into miscalculation, and translated into actions that will spin out of control? So far, I'm not very optimistic on this last one. Those of you who were following the news, there was a bombing of the Iranian embassy in Beirut a few days ago, followed very quickly by a barrage of mortars falling from Iraq into Saudi. These are all messages that are being sent. All it takes is a small miscalculation, and we're going into a spin out of control. So that is the one thing that today I would be concerned about. Two last points, and I will conclude with this. One point is the issue of messaging that you mentioned, Dave. I cannot overestimate, or I cannot overemphasize how important positive messaging is. It's important because the public needs to hear that their leaders are committed, that their leaders have a vision for peace. With all respect to Saeb Erekat, I disagree with him. This is not new, and he makes it very easy to disagree with him, but sometimes. But I would say, if we keep an eye on the rejectionists and how they're going to react to what we say, we're going to go nowhere. When Sadat went to Jerusalem, he was not, how is this going to be seen? Sometimes leaders have to lead. And by leading, you have to stand up for what you believe in. I think this is essential. That's the one point. The second point I want to conclude with this is, with all of this complexity. Look, I mean, you look at the fluidity, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, etc. And this is concern. This is a force of concern. And the usual human nature, and definitely governmental nature, is to be conservative, hunker down, and wait for the tsunami to pass. But fluidity is also a moment of opportunity. And this is where human agency comes in most handy. This is where we see leadership emerging. And I think it is our role as individuals and as communities to be pushing our leaders at this moment and showing them that if they take the steps that they have to take, we are there behind them, supporting them. I think this is an essential policy interest for the US, as well as the Palestinians and Israelis. But for me personally, and I cannot impart this to anyone else, but personally, it is a matter of ethical concern. It is a matter of caring about real people, real lives, real futures. Thank you again for giving me the podium. I'm looking forward to it.
Again, we have heard two superb presentations on our concluding night. And something has come out of all of this that I'm surprised about. Both of you were, I think, as opposed to some of the others who spoke, relatively optimistic, which is something we don't often hear. And one of the speakers, actually a couple of the speakers last time around, displayed their negativism based upon a feeling that, yes, even if the politicians can bring about an agreement, they have not prepared their respective populations for peace. The textbooks in the Palestinian communities and in the Israeli communities, neither of, they present maybe not the sides black and white, but certainly shades of gray. And if there is to be peace, in the end, the communities, the respective communities, are going to have to deal with that. I'd appreciate your thoughts. David, you want to start?
Okay, sure. Yeah, thanks. I'll stand up again.
Okay.
It's a great question. Thank you for that. And I just wrote a whole book about it.
Okay.
So I'm not going to rehash it here, but if
Well, we'll plug the book. What's the
But
name of the book?
okay, it's on the Washington Institute website,
Okay.
and so it's www.washingtoninstitute.org, and it's called Beyond Words,
Okay.
and the subtitle is Causes, Consequences, and Cures for Palestinian Authority Hate Speech. And
Okay.
it deals just with the Palestinian side of the equation, but certainly you could write a whole book.
Right.
And I started doing it and then realized that it was going to be too much, too big, too long. And you could write a whole book about issues on the Israeli side of vigilantism, of incitement, of unofficial, yes, but very, very tragic and destructive of hate speech by people in Israel, by Israelis. So I think it is true that neither side has done a good job of preparing its people for peace. And I think that you often hear, especially from Palestinians in my experiences, you often hear the rationale that first we have to solve the conflict and then we can change our message. Then we'll say nicer things. But as long as we're under occupation, you can't expect us to talk about peace and reconciliation. And I always say, and they also say, and this you get from Israelis, well, the other side does it too. And I feel like saying, are you in kindergarten? I mean, is that really your answer to a serious question? That the other side does it too? Does that mean that you should do it? I mean, I really don't understand it, especially because I really deeply believe that it's self-defeating. If each side just calls the other side names and says bad things, they're never going to get what they want because the other side will never be willing to compromise. So I think this is a very important issue, but where I differ with your other guest, and I don't know who it was, and I don't want to, argue against someone who's not here to argue back, but I don't think that this is an insoluble problem. That's why the subtitle of this book that I wrote has the word cure in it. I think it can be cured. And the reason that I think that, I will give you an example from real life. Okay, it's not hypothetical. This really happened. On the Palestinian side, as much as there is still incitement against Israel and sometimes against Jews in Palestinian media, there actually has been an improvement since 2005. And in other words, since the end of the Second Intifada, the ascendancy of Mahmoud Abbas to leadership, there has been an improvement. And I'll give you a statistic about it to make the point. It's far from perfect. There's still a lot of problems. But if you look at Palestinian textbooks, there was a famous, or pretty well-known anyway, study that was recently done on this with lots of statistics, and it's a controversial study, but I think they make one important basic point. Palestinian textbooks are still mostly negative about Israel and about Jews, but not 100%. Now it's only 84% negative. So people tell me, 84% negative, that's terrible. And I say, yes, it's terrible, but it's better than 100% negative. And if this continues at the same rate, then in 10 years, Palestinian textbooks will be about equal, right? Negative and positive toward Israel and Jews. So why should you only look at what's wrong? Let's also look at the progress that has been made. And there has been progress. It's slow, it's painful, it's uneven. Sometimes there's backsliding. But there is actually movement in the right direction.
I mean, if I may, a couple of words. I mean,
Please.
first of all, yes, it's a great book, Dave's book. Read it.
Thank you.
It's worth it.
And it's free.
And it's free.
It's free.
But actually, I mean, the study you mentioned, I assume you're talking about the Yale study.
The Yale
where,
study.
It's interesting. Not only is there the reduction of the number, you know, the 84%, but the
Yes.
nature
Yes.
of the from dehumanization and demonization to a different kind of negativity. Not perfect. We still have a lot more to do, but there is a good trend. I would say two things, though. I mean, first of all, I mean, partly it's optimism, because I actually see the elements for why a deal could happen. Partly it's a call for action. It is a question of what other option do we have, but to keep on pushing for it. You know, negativism and pessimism is good. No one has lost money betting on lack of progress in the Middle East. But then what? More conflict. So, you know, I choose to exercise my agency as a human and to move. But two words quickly on this. Why am I optimistic? First of all, I actually hate the word peace. For an aspiring peacemaker, I really hate the word peace because it does convey this sense of warm, fuzzy, you know, kumbaya type of feelings. That's what I aspire for. That's what I would like. I would love to see a warm peace between Israel and Palestinians. But I'm willing to live with a cold peace. The peace between Israel and Egypt and the peace between Israel and Jordan is not my ideal for peace. Yet, it survived many, many difficult tests. Both nations, each nation, I mean, in their respective ways, are free of this conflict and can now move to focus on their own lives. This is what I want. So if the peace that I end up with doesn't end up with Palestinians loving Israelis and vice versa, a shame, a real shame, but we'll live with it. The other question is in terms of preparing public opinion. And I do agree that this is a problem. When I was in Camp David, I must say, when at some point we were close to a deal, I panicked. And so did many of us. Oh my God, we go back and tell the people that actually, we've been lying to you for the last 10 years and this is the way the deal is. It's hard, yet my optimism is based on my observation of general political behavior, and maybe human nature. People respond to a credible promise of change. If you look at the political commentary before Oslo, or even after Oslo, everyone was against it, or most people on the Palestinian side were against it, except for a small factor, the public, who were literally putting flowers in the barrels of Israeli soldiers' guns. Why? They saw that there's a chance that their life is going to get better in a real way. I look at the Gaza disengagement. I was an official then. Our position as Palestinian officials we're against it because it is unilateral. And I still maintain this was a true right from a policy perspective. Yet the excitement among the public in Gaza was palpable. They felt finally their lives are going to change. And I think a credible peace agreement that maintains dignity for both sides, not justice, not perfect, it will be imperfect, that has dignity and a real credible promise of change will have overwhelming support. Because it will tell people your life, your kids' life is going to be better. You can start living your lives again.
Thank you. Given the fact that it is getting late, I am going to turn it over to you and ask Rabbi Grossman to come up and moderate some questions.
Because it is late, we're only going to have a few minutes for questions. We're not going to repeat the questions as a way of saving time, so I'd like to ask people, if they have a question, to please stand and try to speak as loudly as possible so that our comments can actually get on the tape. So to give somebody a chance to speak, we have some folks who've been here before, want to give some people who haven't had a chance to speak before. Sir.
That was one of the questions I
I try to avoid answering it.
So the consensus here is that you're not answering.
No,
But let's maybe take a few
Let's take a
questions.
couple
on
of
the-
questions.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
If you,
Can't win.
Could you give us some information about the current Palestinian leadership? Mahmoud Abbas is getting on in years. He's been invited by the Prime Minister. As the Knesset, it doesn't appear that he will. Will he accept right of return or negotiations that Palestinian refugees go back to Haifa and Jaffa and places in Israel? And what about the leadership after Mahmoud Abbas? Coming up behind him that would accept a peace in terms of us?
So, suppose that Israel and Palestine get economic major force in the Middle East, a high-tech country that Palestine would be very eager, very educated population, good labor force. What would that do to the dynamic of the rest of the Middle East? What would this?
I'd like to take at least one more question.
What was the main reason Camp David changed now? What your optimism?
All right, well, I'll take a stab at the Iran question, and I'll leave all the others for Ghaith.
Thank you, David.
My own personal view is that, on balance, the Iran deal is a good thing, considering the alternative. The alternatives were worse, which is do nothing or go to war or try and push harder for a different, maybe a better deal, but one that would have taken a lot longer and might not have come at all. I think it's not a perfect solution, and in fact, by definition, it's only temporary and partial. So they're going to have to try to push forward to make a more lasting agreement. And I think that it doesn't solve the problem, it just reduces it, makes it a little more manageable, a little less risky. But that's, in the real world, it seems to me that's probably the best that you could hope for. And as we move forward, everything will depend on whether Iran actually sticks to the deal or not, and what the reaction will be as the next few months unfold, and on sanctions and on many other things. But I think I would not take everything that people are saying about it at face value. So I think when I put it this way, I think there are different views in Israel on the deal, and the voices that you tend to hear the loudest are the ones who are most critical. But that is not, I think, a full representation of what serious Israeli officials or analysts and experts think about it. I think they are going to be willing to give it a chance and see if it works.
Even Bibi?
Yeah, absolutely, especially Bibi, in my view. He doesn't like it, but I think understands that that now that it's done, Israel needs to bide its time at least for another year or so before making a final judgment.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on Iran. Diplomacy is always better than war, but I stand with what I mean, you know,
Yeah.
whether it's good or bad is a function of how we're going to react post-agreement, starting tomorrow. And to me, as someone who operates in the U.S. and who's, you know, this is my stomping ground these days, it is the most important thing for me is, can the U.S. right now re-establish credibility and trust vis-a-vis the regional allies, in particular Israel and Saudi Arabia, to convince them that they can trust us not to sell their interest down the road. Because if we cannot do that, we will lose our ability to create leadership and to constrain some of the negative action that some in both systems might be willing to undertake. I think in times of crisis and stress, the ability of rogue elements to act in a way that could completely change the direction of things is there. And you need very strong leadership by the leaders, but they will only do this if they feel that someone back here has their back. So I think that's what I would be looking at next. Mahmoud Abbas. Many questions. Let me start with the easiest, maybe. Will he accept no exercise of the right of return? Will he accept all of these? The same question, by the way, can be asked about Bibi. And my answer is, I do not know. If I knew someone's heart, I'll be a much richer man. But I would say the following. I look at behavior. I look at the behavior. I mean, Abbas, I know well enough. I worked for the guy for many years. I know he believes in these things. I know that he believes in a two-state solution. I know he was willing to lose his premiership. I was his political advisor. We knew when we went to Aqaba and gave the speech that we gave, recognizing the Jewish connection to the land, etc., we knew that this might cost us cost him his premiership. So he's a guy who believes in these things. Now, when it comes to the moment of truth, will he do it, will he not do it? I don't know. One thing that Bibi and Abu Mazen have in common, though, is that they are risk-averse leaders. They are leaders, look, in many ways we were spoiled in the Middle East by having historic leaders. The Sadats and the Rabins and even the Arafats and the Sharons who by decision and by the force of will changed the shape of their nations and the shape of politics. And we expect this from our leaders these days. Well, they're not. Bibi and Abu Mazen are not like this. The question is, how do you build a mix of, on the one hand, incentive for them, a sense that they might get their public behind them, and frankly, a bit of pain as well. If you do not reach a deal, there's also something to pay in exchange. How do we manage them like we manage real politicians, with carrots and sticks? I think this will very much increase the likelihood that come the moment of truth, their ability to deliver is enhanced. Here again, I go to the issue of, in the Palestinian side at least, the regional dimension. Abbas's ability to deliver a deal and to sign a deal will be much enhanced if he has the Arabs, particularly the Saudis, behind him and the Egyptians, and they will not be behind him unless they feel their interest in other things, in Iran in particular, are met. So this is the conundrum we have here. The issue of future Palestinian leadership is exactly the kind of issue that I talked about, that I had in mind when I mentioned the issue of reform. Reform has three components: security, which is essential for Palestinians domestically and vis-a-vis relations with Israel. And I must say, the success of security, reform, and cooperation has made it today that the IDF in Israel, I believe, the strongest advocate for Palestinian interests. Counterintuitive maybe, but so that's working well. Governance is working well. What has not worked well is political reform. Opening the political space for people to climb up the political system. Right now, if something were to happen to Abbas, I'll be very, very worried about what's going to happen next, because there is no mechanism for creating succession. And frankly, he and people around him have been very consistent in ensuring that no candidates emerge. Credible, everyone who starts getting a bit strong gets pushed out of the way. So it comes to us in this country, as we engage the Palestinians, to ask ourselves the question: do we go back to the 90s, where we allowed Arafat a leeway and a free hand in doing things that ended up biting him and us and everyone in the backside? Or do we have a sincere, if you wish, tough love conversation, saying we're doing this not because we're trying to pressure you, but because we think this is your interest, and frankly, it's our interest. We need to have reform, political, and governance. You touched on one of the core issues. Economy, regional dynamic. I would, by the way, throw in a third player, which is Jordan. Jordan is an important player in this. Look, in Palestine, I can't speak about Israel. In Palestine, when I lived there, we had, within the secular national camp, we had two trends. One trend, which I personally belong to, that I saw the future of Palestine looking westwards. My economy, my development is more Europe, US oriented. Israel is a natural gateway in this particular case. Others, of course, so the future of Palestine eastwards, a repetition of Ben Ali's Tunis and Mubarak's Egypt and what have you. And one of the sides is going to win. I don't know who's going to win. We had Fayyad, who represented where I stand. He was on the ascendance. Now he's not on the ascendance. That's a domestic Palestinian issue. One comment, though, in economy. While I do believe that this is the better thing, I do not believe that these are things that we need to negotiate to pre-negotiate. The more we overload the negotiation process, the more we minimize the chance of success. I would say the negotiations are about the core issue. Don't look at it as a flirtation, where and a courtship, where you need to know everything about your prospective future spouse. Think of it as a divorce. What are the core things that you need to get this out of the way, and maybe we'll be friends afterwards, and maybe not. Either way is good, either way we'll be friends. Now to the very easy question of why did Camp David fail? It failed for many reasons. Partly we were not prepared. We did not prepare our public. Partly, you do not bring leaders to be negotiators. You bring leaders to make decisions. We came to the Camp David with the issues not ripe. So we had the leaders having to play the role of negotiators. It doesn't work that way. Thirdly, we have learned something about the US role. On day 2 or 3, I can't remember, they put an idea on the table. We had a hissy fit on the Palestinian side. Barak started packing his bags and went and locked himself in his room. And the Americans chickened out and pulled their proposals from the table. At which point it was over, from my perspective. We could roll over the Americans, therefore there was no responsible adult in the room. We were, going to what you said, Dave, we were kids throwing mud at one another. Fourthly or fifthly or whatever, but most importantly, actually, putting all that aside, to me, the main lesson that I learned from Camp David is none of the above. That we can actually manage all the time. Camp David actually was a great moment where despite all of this, many breakthroughs happened. The division of Jerusalem was first broached in Camp David. Land swaps was first broached meaningfully in Camp David. Abbas, Arafat, had to go and instruct the security negotiators. I was doing the security file at that point. We got instructions to slow down. You're almost about to reach a deal on security, while we made great progress. The failure was not in the substantive progress. The failure was in the spin. And in politics, and here, all respect to President Obama, style is substance. All right? Unlike what he said about Syria. We came out of Camp David. We could have spun it in 2 ways. We could have spun it, which we did not, as great progress was made by the leaders. We made the breakthroughs. Now you negotiators go back to Jerusalem and Ramallah, meet for 2 months, and let's meet again in January, just before Clinton is to leave office, to have a conclusion summit. We could have then leveraged and energized the progress we made into reaching a deal. And by the way, we did have some talks that culminated in the Clinton parameters, which broke us very clear. They decided that for tactical political reasons, we're going to go into the blame game. It failed because of this, and because of you, and because of you. Well, we all had our share of the blame. And I'm not getting, books have been written about it, and everyone spins their own view. I believe we all had share of the blame. The lesson I learned, though, is if you decide to declare a failure, it comes with a price. And to sound very, maybe glib about it, or maybe too simplistic about it, whether you say the glass is full half or full empty has ramifications for the side's engagement in the process, and for the public support of the process, and for the empowerment of spoilers in this process. We saw one model in Camp David, and I sincerely hope we do not repeat that, and we learn some of these procedural issues that ultimately, I think, will be the make or break of a deal.
Can I just say one very last quick comment, if I may, about the economic issue that somebody asked about. I think that there really is, I agree with Ghaith that this is not a core issue, and it would be better not to focus too much on it until the other issues are solved. And that you didn't say this, but I will say that economic progress cannot substitute for a political solution to serious problems and that need to be resolved. But if there is an agreement, then the economic potential of Palestinians and Israelis and others working together is enormous. It's absolutely, I would say it's awesome. I mean, honestly, the high-tech, I wrote another paper, you can also find it on the Washington Institute website about.
And it's free, too.
And it's also
Okay,
free, right?
wow.
Shows you how much I know about economics. I'm giving away my books for free. But there's a paper, it's called Asset Test, Asset, A-S-S-E-T, Test, right? About Israel's high-tech potential and the potential in a regional context would be really extremely beneficial all around the region. And you can see examples of that in the limited cooperation that Israel has with Egypt and Jordan. Despite the cold peace, as Ghaith very correctly described it, the economic ties between those countries are of substantial benefit to all three of them. If that could be extended to the obvious people right in the middle, the Palestinians, then I think all sides would benefit tremendously. And Palestinians most of all, but it would be of great benefit to Israel too, even just from an economic perspective.
I think we have to end here, unfortunately. I do want to thank our speakers, amazing, inspiring, and with your input in the world, hopefully it will actually result in a peace in our lifetime faster than 20 years, hopefully. When we say Bimhei Rabbi, I mean soon.
Okay,
soon, please.
Right.
Any suggestions?
John Kerry.
John Kerry?
John Kerry is serving as a mailman right now. And if he,
Could be
if
worse.
it works, it works.
The
I want to
mailman.
actually take that opportunity to introduce the president of the Howard County Muslim Council, Grossman Sigidi, and we are together planning our next few events. And if anyone would like to volunteer to participate, we have our annual Interfaith Martin Luther King Friday night service, which is January 17th. And we sing prayers for peace at that, obviously, in Hebrew and in Arabic and in English. And we are following up on that following Monday as part of the Howard County Human Rights Commission's Day of Action. So we'll be doing social action work together as a Jewish and Muslim community and Christian community. And then we are in the process of speaking about what our next program will be, hosted at the Islamic Center, Dar al-Taqwa. And I'd like to recognize one of the founders of our Islamic Center, Saeed Salah, and welcome to have you here as well. We also have the president of the Howard County Jewish Federation here, Rob Kahn. So it's great to have you as well. So we have partners here. Our goal is to continue this work, and we thank you for, on the national level, and we'll try on the local level to help create the environment to be able to hear the positive and be able to keep the negative in perspective. And may we go in peace and help build peace in all that we do as we head towards the holiday season, a time of Thanksgiving, for living in a country that allows us to get together and speak freely and work together in partnership. May we go in peace. Salam, shalom, and good evening.